Alright, hey you guys, welcome to book review number 51. Now I'm having to do this real quiet because normally I go to the library and get a study room where I can talk at my full volume level, but all the rooms are taken up, so I'm having to do this in the library and having to do it real quietly. So anyway, for book review number 51, I'm going to be reviewing The Motion of the Ocean, One Boat, Two Average Lovers, A Woman's Search for the Meaning of Life. Not meaning of life, but meaning of life. By Janna, Cawrse, Esarey. And what this book basically is it's about a newlywed couple. I'm going to leave it here for just 1 second. Let's sit down. It's about a newlywed couple that decides for their honeymoon, I guess, after a long time, dating a long time, and not tying the knot after they eventually do tie the knot, for their honeymoon to take a sailboat from Seattle, Washington, down the coast of North America, and then across the South Pacific, first in Polynesia, then Melanesia, and then into Micronesia, through the Philippines, and finally ending their journey in Hong Kong. So it's a boat travel. Because it is sort of boat travel, it's more internally focused than a lot of books that I review. It's a lot more about Janna and Graham. Those are the two newlywed couples, kind of their experience on the boat, rather than really focus on the culture that they're going through. And not only the mechanics of the boat, but also, I guess, the mechanics of the relationship. That being said, there is a lot of cultural observation that takes place, and it's kind of enjoyable because it kind of seeps in secondarily, and so it feels kind of forthright and honest rather than being like overwrought, which is the case. The case a lot of times in the books that I tend to read and review. Not all of them, but like some of them just try to be overly analytical, I guess. Whereas the over-analysis that goes on in this tends to be of the relationship. Now, it has the pun in the title, would recommend. This is a pretty frilly kind of read. It does focus on deep issues, but there's a lot of like puns and silly jokes and silly circumstances. But in general, if you're breaking it down into gender stereotypes, one might say it's a very girly book, but I liked reading it, and I'm a guy. So anyway, to the journey itself, like I said, it starts out with all the planning involved. I think they call it the BHAG, which is an acronym for something I don't remember. But anyway, after their wedding, which is kind of small and low budget, they take this boat, which is what do they call it? Is it the Dragonfly? I think it's the Dragonfly, maybe. Yeah, the Dragonfly. Which is this book was written in the late 2000s, I want to say, and the boat was built in the 1970s. So it's kind of like a classic car of a boat, which means that it has a lot of sentimental value, but also has a tendency to kind of break down a lot. She mentions throughout the book that the alternator, which is the source of electricity on the boat, much like an alternator is in a car, constantly broke, and Graham, her husband, who was the much more hands-on practical of the two, had to go and fix it. So anyway, on this boat, the Dragonfly, which is a small boat, this isn't a rich couple, this is just kind of your average couple that could kind of take what they could get in terms of taking a year off and getting boats. Some of us can't afford to do that at all, but they're not the Gateses out of Seattle. if you will. They go out of Seattle, and the main thing I remember about the Northwest was there was this passage of them passing around the bend from Puget Sound in the San Joaquin Straits, I want to say, into open ocean, and she tells it very dramatically. And, there's just the general sort of foggy, wet nature of the Northwest of the United States that comes through. Anyway, they go down the coast to California, and this is when they start getting involved in the boat community. Now, the shortwave radios that they used communicated with other seafaring crew, most of who were much older, many of them retired. But still, because of their kind of carefree nature of boat riding, they enjoyed the company of these older peoples. They would often have cocktail parties where the women and the men would segregate, and the women would tell, the men would go play like poker and tell guy jokes, and the women would tell like, I don't know, outrageous women jokes, whatever those are, like women how to piss over the side of the boat instead of having to go to the tiny latrine on the boat all the time. So anyway, they eventually go down to Mexico after that. After, they do mention that they go to, what is it, like the Central Coastal region? What is that called? Big Sur. They go to Big Sur and, they visit the mansion of the Rosebud guy, William Randall Hearst, newspaper man. Enjoyed that. They really kind of skip the big cities because they figure, it's a little too crowded, whatever. So there isn't really much about Los Angeles or San Diego. They do go into the Bay Area of San Francisco, to retrack a little bit, and kind of enjoy a little bit of San Francisco, but more enjoy the Bay region, like the Marion County region, with all the tall pines and firs and whatever, and eating mussels on the boardwalk, that kind of stuff. Touristy, but also, you can't say not high quality of life, enjoyable. And certainly a change of scenery from being stuck on a little tiny boat eating ramen noodles all the time and canned goods. Well, anyway, after they go through California and go down to Mexico, and this is when they really have to make their big decision, because they've really gotten to be friends with some of these older people on the boat. I think one of them is called the Queen, and then, it's should they choose to the more adventurous trip, which is to go through the South Pacific Islands as originally intended, or should they just kind of enjoy their honeymoon as long as they can in a more relaxed fashion by just merely boating around Mexico, which is, very sort of, you can do a kind of languid pace and, isn't real challenging, but it's also very enjoyable, not only for the company, but for the hospitable culture that, the boating Mexican culture kind of merges with. If you've ever been to the west coast of Mexico, you know what I'm talking about. Cabo San Lucas, like Acapulco. I think the big one they went to in here was Mazatlan, where they spent like 2 weeks in Mazatlan, eating tacos and, visiting with locals and stuff. Well, anyway, the decision they decide to make is to go down to Costa Rica, but then they will do the cutover. So in Costa Rica, they go to this island that's like a, look it up, it definitely says in here what it's called. Isla de Coco, or Chocolate Island, which is a island, like I think about 100 miles off the coast of Costa Rica, but it's a volcanic island and goes like this. So, and it's right in the middle of the rainforest. In Mexico it's more desert-like, but here it's, and so they go view like the waterfall, and go and climb this mountain. And one of the things about this area is that there's tons and tons of rain. It rains all the time, which makes it very lush and green and beautiful, but also makes it very hazardous to hike. And because of the storms, also makes it very dangerous, not only for boats, but like getting in and off the island, you have to take like a little watercraft. I think they call it a, see, I'm not a boater. But whatever that boat is that you go when you don't have a dock. you anchor off the island and then take a little like motorboat to and from the shoreline. She mentions that they almost flipped over. I'm not sure they would have drowned, but the waves were high enough that they could have easily flipped over and been in very dangerous straits. And just as they went over this wave, they were just barely able to avoid it, and then came down and made it to their boat. Very sort of high intensity moment. I'm in the library, so I can't really say how high intensity it was, but it was very intense. So after that, they go over to the Galapagos Islands, where Graham, the husband, fixes the boat, and she visits the turtles. Talks about, like the turtle that was around since Darwin's days. It's like 250 years old or something. The oldest mammal in existence. I think maybe the oldest animal in existence. And also they talk about, there was this turtle that was dying off and the unique biology of the region. And after that, they did make the crossing, which is much like a metaphor for the challenge of marriage, which is something that's constantly brought up throughout the book. It's kind of the metaphor of the challenge of marriage, particularly, I guess, early on, because this is their honeymoon. But I guess even the challenge of a relationship versus, the challenge of boating. There's a lot of metaphors between the two, and it's a little bit cheap, but I think also, while Janna tends to make stretches at times, she doesn't make every stretch. Like, she makes a lot of stretches relating boating to marriage, but, does a good job in using her full vocabulary to describe it. I don't know. She talks about how, unlike in normal social circumstances, this circumstance on them on the boat really, and this is a good time to mention this because of the long crossing they made, really both brought Janna and Graham together in terms of how much time they had to spend together and mutually working out tasks together, but also sort of drove them apart in that the amount of time they had to spend together really didn't allow them to live separate lives, almost. Or, like, you need time away from your significant other, just because any two people, it's like prison. If you're with somebody all the time, they're going to eventually drive you mad, no matter what their personality is or how much you love them, or whatever. But anyway, she talks about how, they almost ran out of food, and they would just kind of like, it's kind of stir crazy, kind of cabin fever, but instead of cabin fever in the woods, cabin fever on the ocean. But then there were the moments of sublimity, or sublime moments. Yeah. Like when the dolphin pod came and swam alongside their boat right in the middle of the ocean, kind of during sunset, and you could almost feel the dolphins kind of performing for the dragonfly, their boat, a little bit. That was really cool. And I think they saw a whale once. So these very sublime moments and very beautiful moments. The blue of the sky, the blue of the deep blue ocean, and kind of them, just the two of them squeezed in between. I have to pause for a second. But anyway, they do eventually reach Tahiti, where they meet up with a few of their friends. Now, there are a lot fewer friends in French Polynesia than there are in the rest of the, in Mexico and stuff along the west coast. But there are some people that made the crossing with them, and that's kind of a thing when you make the crossing. So they all get together, and before even declaring customs, so they're in French Polynesia kind of illegally, they all have a big party together, and I think this is when they get the tattoo. We can talk about Graham and Janna mutually getting a tattoo. And then they head over to, I think they go to Tahiti briefly. But I think they just viewed it. I don't really remember too much about that section, but Then they went over to the Cook Islands, which are the next, sovereign area. The Cook Islands aren't, just like French Polynesia isn't a country, the Cook Islands aren't a country either. They're ruled by France and New Zealand, respectively. But in the Cook Islands, he meets an administrator from New Zealand who is kind of a loose cannon and is supposed to be preserving the ecology, but really uses it largely for his own food source and feeding guests and stuff. And she mentioned actually when they leave that he got kicked out of his job because you're not really supposed to be feeding semi-endangered animals, not completely endangered, but semi-endangered animals to local yachters as a mean of getting on their good side, even though like what he was feeding them was like coconut crabs and delicious seafood type stuff. Then they go over to Samoa. Well, let's see, how are we going to do this? Because there's quite a few areas that they went through. Samoa, where they saw the very languid pace of life that was the most traditional of all of the islands in the South Pacific. Yeah, hadn't been affected as much by missionaries. Maybe that was where they got the tattoo. They either got in French Polynesia or in Samoa. And then they went up to Kiribati, which were these low-lying atolls. She actually mentioned that as idyllic as the atolls were, now these are not the ones with mountains, but with the ones that are just like very low-lying sand with lagoons and stuff. As idyllic as they were, they eventually drove her a little bit crazy because it was sort of similar to being on the open ocean, but almost worse because there was the tease of land, but it was not really any sort of geography or hiking at all. It was, you get 200 meters or 500 meters across of just sand and, just long strips of this. And there would be inhabitants there, but, she also mentions she saw some Peace Corps workers there, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm thinking about possibly joining the Peace Corps. And how they were kind of adjusted to island life, both in their complaints and in their slower pace of life, I guess. Then they go through the Marshall Islands and Cawrse in Federated States of Micronesia. And they saw more waterfalls, did more hiking, just kind of boaty stuff. Now, I will mention at this point that once they cut up from Samoa, they were separated from almost all the yachters, so that social aspect of it was lost, which she said really drove them, her and Graham apart a lot. You would think it would maybe bring them closer together, but it drove them apart because they were literally isolated by themselves outside of, I guess they saw like locals on the island, but in terms of people that could relate to, fellow yachters, fellow boaters, it was them. It was just them. Everyone else went down to New Zealand because they were actually going through these areas during hurricane or typhoon season, which is not highly recommended, but they wanted to get to Hong Kong, whereas everyone else that had more money and more time went down to New Zealand to wait out the hurricane season and then go up to the Philippines and Asia in the off season, if you will. So they go to the Philippines, and that's actually brings me to my next point, where they experience a hurricane and get hunkered down. And she mentions that this is when they took the longest time off the boat, that they actually took, I think, about a month and a half, at least in terms of when they're riding, to live in a local community, go to church there, I think. Well, no, they didn't go to church, but they kind of got involved in how church-like the Philippines are. So, not necessarily religious, but kind of very socially involved in the small community. And they actually had to go to a dry dock, I think it was a dry dock, in order to avoid a huge hurricane that came in. The thing about this huge hurricane that came in, or typhoon as they were called in this region, is it actually petered out. There was just some rain. That was it. So they took all these precautions in the Philippines for absolutely nothing. She did mention the nice attitudes of everyone in the Philippines, that it was a friendly place, if you will. finally, she moves on to Hong Kong, and mentions at this point that they had actually been to Hong Kong previously, and mentions some of the things that they had done there, like the Star Ferry, Victoria Peak, all the kind of tourist things, but also how those tourist things, excuse me, how all those, I have in the library, how all those tourist things really, the first time and this time, brought them closer together, if you've been to Victoria Peak, if you stand and look out over the skyscrapers in Hong Kong Harbor with your fellow lover, or average lover, as the book title would say, it really is pretty romantic, So she mentions that, and then they decided, they were originally going to go all the way around the Ring of Fire, so up to Japan and then over to Alaska. But they decided at this point that, they had been through enough trials and tribulations that what they had wanted to get on this journey, they had gotten. So they weren't really defeated, but they had just won, I guess. They had gotten what they wanted. Now, it took them about 6 months to realize that as they lived in Hong Kong. Graham did some consulting. Janna did some English teaching and writing, like writing this book, and writing a novel. But then they eventually decided to just ship the container back to Seattle. And that's where they live today. 2 average lovers, I guess. So, I know I've gone on a little bit, but this is a good book. And if you're having any relationship problems, it's a good one to read. If you like travel books, but you don't want it just so kind of like dry or analytic, you want some fun, and you want some relationship gossip or dishing or whatever, this is a good one to read. So, I've gone on a little long. The Motion of the Ocean, 1 Small Boat, 2 Average Lovers, and a Woman's Search for the Meaning of Life by Janna, Cawrse. Man, I'm really mangling this. Janna, Cawrse, Esarey. Sorry, Janna, I messed this up, but there you go. Alright, see you guys later. Hey, check out my next book. It's going to be on Hong Kong, too. My next review, it's going to be on Hong Kong. Book in Hong Kong. Bye.